Hello and welcome to a Watching Brief special bulletin. This is a video outside our normal monthly schedule because we feel compelled to comment on a news story which broke in the past 24 hours or so. I'm joined by my co-host Andy Brockman.
Hello, Mark.
Hello, and together we have been disappointed, I think it's fair to say, by something which occurred last night. And would you like to fill us in, Andy?
Well, last night, Hinckley and Bosworth Borough Council in the English East Midlands granted planning consent for a Japanese company called Horibamira to build a test track for autonomous vehicles on part of the registered battlefield of Bosworth. It's a heritage asset, as it's called, of the highest national importance. A lot of people would argue of international importance. So the decision that was taken last night to allow part of it to be effectively destroyed by being built on and changed irrevocably has been taken by a single local authority.
And this is a news story which we covered in the most recent batch of Watching Brief videos. This was very much on the horizon. Well, I mean, I learned about this having woken up to your post on the Archaeosuit Facebook page. You have admin privileges, and people's response to this post, it was actually incredulity. At that point, the vote was being reported as having gone through by a margin of 12-5, and
That's right.
and I mean, it should be just restated for the purposes of this video that the Battle of Bosworth Field is a crucial battle in the history of these islands, certainly of England and Wales, in so much as it's the moment in time when the Plantagenets' rule over England comes to an end. In comes Henry VII, and the Tudors really take over. And from my perspective as a Welshman, it forever redefines Wales as and England's relationship as political entities. Essentially, following the Act of Union, Wales becomes a Principality of England under Henry VIII, and so on and so forth. So this is a singular battle in terms of the history of the United Kingdom, and you would think that this would therefore be a singularly protected battlefield site. Battlefield sites are afforded protection, but you think this one would be high up there on the list. Do we think that something has gone wrong in this instance?
I think very many people do. If you look at the social media response to the decision, which came in really yesterday, in the middle of yesterday evening, about 8 o'clock, since then, the social media response has been a mixture of incredulity, which you've registered on the Archaeosuit website, but also actually blind fury on the part of some people, and a cold anger on the part of some experts and commentators, because I think they feel, many people feel, that the Battle of Bosworth and the personalities involved, Richard III and Henry VII, to the key personalities in English medieval history, and actually cultural history too. Richard III being the villain of one of Shakespeare's most iconic plays, so it's right at the centre of literary culture as well as historical culture in Western Europe, in the Western world, in the English-speaking world. So for the site of that to be of those moments in history and culture to be irrevocably damaged, people can't understand how it's come about.
Indeed, desecrated, you could almost say. In so much as there are people who will be feeling this passionately about that patch of land. Now, this does come in the context of. I think this is something that I touched on when we talked about this issue before. When it was simply something which was coming up. This comes in the context of a desire, in this country at least, stated desire by the government to provide a safe haven for especially technology development firms. So development of autonomous vehicles was mentioned as one of the technologies which would be given high priority in terms of development, and also actually reassessing regulations when it comes to, for example, implementation of safety rules and this kind of thing, just to make it easier for the tech companies to do business in Britain. And also, actually, today in The Independent, Theresa May is quoted as saying that the UK will be unequivocally pro-business after Brexit. The government is desperate to say that we're open for business. And in that sense, I don't think any archaeologist or historian, any right-minded archaeologist or historian, is saying that we shouldn't, as a nation, be doing that. But did we have to do it on Bosworth Field? It feels tremendously symbolic.
That is one of the key issues that's come out of this, and it's one of the issues why I suspect this story is going to run, because it's an iconic. It's a bit like those of us that are old enough to remember the row over Shakespeare's Rose Theatre in the 1980s, when it was almost destroyed by a building development, and it led to modern development archaeology, effectively, which was meant to head off this kind of situation before they arose. What we now appear to have is a situation where the checks and balances that were put in to protect the historic environment as part of the planning system have now either morphed or been deliberately changed, so that they actually, in certain cases, and battlefields being one, they actually offer very little protection at all.
Well, with the Rose Theatre, though, there was an element of embarrassment. So, yeah. The fact of the matter was that the authorities, people knew what might be there. That stuff had been mapped and was, but it was the fact that it was naked avarice and building building ambition that was shown to be tearing up elements of this nation's history, and suddenly the government and other people were put into a very embarrassing situation of having to answer the question: do you actually care about this or not? In this instance, given that happened 30 odd years ago, in this instance, actually, what we're seeing is, I guess, in the context of embarrassments, possibly like essentially a shameless move, because the priority at the moment is business. So therefore, it leads me, at least as an archaeologist, and in that sense I am very biased. I am an archaeologist. I care about history and archaeology and battlefield sites and this kind of thing. It leads me to ask, where is the protection, and is the protection possibly a bit toothless at the moment? What's happened to the status of a battlefield site when this can happen, and indeed can happen on a local level? This hasn't been stamped by the Home Office. This hasn't been okayed. This has been simply okayed by local councillors. What's going on, and what does this signal in terms of Britain's attitude to our physical and landscape history for the rest of the world?
This is the key problem, I think. What has happened here is that most planning applications are very simple, and they go through almost on the nod. Planning archaeology is something we're very good at in this country, and it's a simple planning condition, and it's discharged very, very easily. And most sites aren't of a quality that warrant preservation, to be frank. Preservation by record is a perfectly adequate response. But occasionally you get a site like this, which is so important, so archaeologically important and sensitive, but also so culturally iconic, that the simple location of it in the borough of Hinckley and Bosworth is transcended by its importance as part of English national culture, of English-speaking culture, if you like. But the system still treats that as a local planning application, as though it was somebody wanting to put up a couple of houses on a piece of spare ground.
Yeah.
And the planning rules as they are at the moment, although the National Planning Policy Framework classes registered battlefields, of which Bosworth is one, as heritage assets, to use the jargon, of the highest importance, it doesn't give them statutory protection. So it has less protection, actually, than even a most basic Grade 2 listed house.
Has less protection than a wall that the local community have gone, let's keep that wall.
Precisely. That's exactly the problem.
And I find that astonishing. And I'm not feigning this in that sense. I made the assumption that battlefield status would come with a certain amount of protection, but that's incredible.
No, the way it's meant to work is that it's recognised as an asset of the highest importance. All the submissions and environmental impact assessments and archaeological impact assessments and so on are meant to address that issue, and Historic England, as the regulator, issue an advisory letter to the local authority with their opinion based on that evidence. And in this case, what Historic England gave as their opinion was that the development would cause minimal harm to the site, and that they could see the economic benefits of the development going ahead. Now, two things about that. Many independent experts are absolutely incredulous that the total destruction of what is now seen archaeologically and by the historians who've been working on Bosworth as a key part of the battlefield, where Henry VII, the victor of the battle, first saw Richard III's army and deployed his troops, and it's less than 500 metres, it's estimated, from the point where Richard was actually killed. That could be destroyed and taken out forever from any understanding of the battle and any presentation of the battle for to visitors, to tourists.
Well, because as you were saying when we were talking about this previously, that the focus of the battle, it seems over time, research has shown, is in fact in that direction.
Precisely.
It's more and more likely that is not an inconsequential corner of this battlefield.
Absolutely. Yeah. So it didn't take account of the most modern research and even the most modern archaeology, some of which was actually undertaken for this planning application. The other thing that people are incredulous and some are very, very angry about is the comment in the letter that Historic England sent, that they recognised the economic benefits of the project. People have argued that is going way beyond their remit. They're not there to say, actually, we think this is a really good idea on economic grounds.
Because I mean, then you are a couple of sentences away from saying, and by the way, I really like the idea of turning up and having a look round. That's not your job. You're not there to comment on what you think the impact will be of the proposed development.
No, people are particularly angry because one of the councillors supporting the application last night at the planning meeting particularly referenced that point precisely, that Historic England appeared to be at least tacitly supporting the application. They didn't actually overtly support it, but the wording of their letter was ambiguous enough that it could be taken as support.
Yes, but you see, once again, we're in this strange time in Britain, in British political history and the landscape, whereby the economic argument is always the biggest one. I think we've commented in the past, or I've certainly complained in the past on Watching Brief, that at the moment the conversation around the shape of Britain in the near future is basically a business plan. The actual substance of culture, the substance of what makes this society what it is not really being protected or being prioritised in these conversations. It's all about a bottom line, essentially, and whether or not that bottom line is going to suffer after we supposedly leave the EU in March. This is very disappointing. What can people expect then in the coming days and weeks?
Well, my sources are telling me that key organisations who've been opposing the planning application are taking legal advice about whether they can take this to judicial review. That's a very difficult and rather expensive process, but it could prevent or could at least slow down the development and maybe give people pause to think again. And for example, if they came under enough pressure, Mira might decide that the PR value was more in going somewhere else than carrying on with the plan which they've got consent for. At the moment, there's no sign of that happening. They called the bluff of the protesters and the council, in fact, in the month between the original deferral and last night's planning decision. They appeared to make no changes or concessions to the criticism. So I don't think at the moment we can expect anything from that point of view. As I say, it may go to judicial review. I think also there is more to come on the process about how this came about, who was talking to who said what to who, and what potential pressure might have been brought on various parties to have this go through.
I suppose I just want to finally come back to this point of if they do feel compelled to go elsewhere, that's possibly an overreaction. I think most people who are frustrated about the situation don't necessarily want to see them go miles and miles away, but modify the plans. And in this instance, perhaps actually a better description or explanation as to what the priorities of the site are in that instance, or in that on that point, may well help this sort of this modification to occur. I mean, one of the things that comes to mind is flat land is useful, especially for these sorts of developments when you're doing test tracks for autonomous vehicles. But presumably, if we're talking about the rise that Richard came up to initially in the battle, it's going to need landscaping anyway. There must be some real world things that can be done to change this plan, as opposed to simply putting it through it as is. I mean, I know this is fully understanding the fact that we exist in a world where changing a plan or saying that you got something wrong in the first place is often seen as some sort of legal culpability. But
Yes.
but surely before actual damage is done to the site, hopefully there can be an assessment here, a re-evaluation.
Well, as I said, I think that was the expectation between the deferral and last night's vote. There appears to have been no engagement on those grounds whatsoever, and so we're into uncharted territory, really. I think the other point that needs to be made is the implications about coming from this regarding Historic England. Historic England is meant to be the conservation body and the regulator that conserves the historic environment, protects and promotes and conserves the historic environment on behalf of the nation. But this, Bosworth, is now joining a rather unfortunate queue of other projects where Historic England's input has been treated very critically. The Garden Bridge in London, and in particular the Stonehenge tunnel and dual carriageway, have been very controversial, and HE has found itself on the wrong side of independent experts, even in the heritage sector. And I think if the national regulator loses the confidence of archaeologists and historians who are working towards supposedly working towards the same end, that could actually be very serious for both, not just Historic England, but actually for any kind of conservation of and the hope of any kind of joined up thinking about conservation of the historic environment across the board. I'm just looking at some of the Twitter comments on this, and Tom Holland, the classicist, has very specifically and writer has very specifically linked Bosworth to Stonehenge, and he's tweeted, "What's wrong with our heritage groups? Why are organisations that should be protecting our history selling it down the river? First the Stonehenge landscape, now Bosworth Field." I think we're at a potentially very tricky, potentially quite dangerous place for heritage protection and the professional heritage community, because everybody's going to be looking at this, and if people can't work out something together, then they're going to end up taking sides, and that's not good for anybody.
No. Now, at this point, I just feel compelled to once again just point out, for the sake of those people who may be about to sort of comment and suggest that archaeologists simply want Historic England to dive in and oppose everything that may well come onto their inbox, that's not really, I think, what anyone's after. It's more that, as in any good decision-making process with good government, good leadership, good management, good consultation in any form, there has to be some solid form of opposition, even if that's just a theoretical opposition when you're constructing an idea or a notion. Historic England really should be, in this instance, arguably stepping up to the plate and not necessarily helping these things to happen. Certainly not commenting on the economic potential of a development. Rather, they should be, maybe even if they think that they probably are going to allow something to occur with it in one form or another, they should be making the developer work to get over those hurdles so that the outcome is the best it can be, forming and shaping and sculpting the thing so that what comes out is the best for modern life, for the local community, but also actually for the long-term care and management of these historic sites. I think that's probably just worthwhile just reinforcing that, just because I think this is a good idea. These sorts of developments really do need to happen.
I agree with you. And as I said earlier, most planning applications go through with no problems at all of this kind.
Hmm.
I was talking to somebody earlier on today about this, and their view was that it's actually about gradation.
Hmm.
We need to have a properly graded response to these sites,
Hmm.
and if a site is listed, as Bosworth is, as of being the highest heritage importance,
Hmm.
then actually at some point you just have to say no, or that kind of designation becomes meaningless.
Yeah.
And the argument is that here the designation has become meaningless because a development's been allowed to go ahead which independent experts say will cause substantial harm. Historic England disagree. The applicant appears to have made no concessions in terms of moving anything or reschedule, whatever, to
To mitigate the
accommodate
effect.
the heritage
Hmm.
concerns. And so basically, the, the system appears to have broken down.
Yeah. And in these instances, I used to say something along the lines of we need to be careful because after all, where the UK government goes and historic environment matters, the rest of the world sometimes follows. But I think rapidly we're losing some of our moral high ground when it comes to management of these landscapes. If we're not careful, Britain or the UK government, in this instance an English landscape. They may well become cautionary tales as opposed to best practice case
We've
studies.
we've got two World Heritage sites that are currently under threat: Liverpool and Stonehenge.
Mm.
Bosworth. Some of the people promoting Bosworth say actually it could have been a World Heritage site. It could never be now if
No,
this goes ahead.
no. Mm.
So, that those are the kind of stakes we're playing for here, and you're quite right. It's I don't want to overstate it, but I do think that with these issues coming together, Stonehenge, Bosworth, Liverpool, and others that we could mention, we are at a real potential hinge point, or a junction, and our heritage protection could go either way. And if we don't have a dialogue about it, it'll go in a way that is potentially pretty divisive.
Yeah. Okay, well, we shall, of course, continue to keep an eye on this, and I imagine in the next watching brief there may well be some developments to cover.
I think there will be.
Is there any place or website that you'd like to sort of point people towards?
Well, we're always covering the breaking news on the pipeline, and on our kissing. But in all seriousness, I mean, the of the organisations that are involved in this, obviously Historic England has its view and it has its own website.
Mm-hmm.
It put out a holding statement previously about it. There hasn't been an update today that I'm aware of, but obviously we'll watch for any comments coming from that direction. The Battlefields Trust is the key community stakeholder
Yep.
in this, and they are pretty furious
Okay.
about the way the whole thing has been handled. At a more on the historical level, the Richard III Society too has been very vocal
Yep.
about this, and in fact, a representative from the Richard III Society was the only person who was allowed to put a contra view last night in front of the planning committee. They worked together with Battlefields Trust actually to come up with a script,
Right.
but the councillors who took that decision last night heard one person speaking for 3 minutes, and you have to say, is that fit for purpose when you're making a decision of national, if not international, importance?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we'll put links to those websites below, and of course, we'd invite people to do comment below as well. If you have any thoughts or suggestions, maybe for the planning people, I can think of something. I can tell them what to do with their planning. Just please do comment below, and we may well address some of those comments as well.
Well, I think we should
coverage.
perhaps say now. I think it's very likely that. Well, I think we should discuss this again in the next watching brief, because I think it is probably one of the most important issues we've covered in the time we've been doing watching brief. Quite what this means for heritage protection, in heritage legislation, planning, and archaeology.
Okay. Well, you've got a dog to walk. and I've got
I have.
I've got things to be getting on with. This wasn't part of my schedule for the day, so
No.
I'll say bye bye, Andy, and thank you as ever, guys, for well, tuning in. If that's a phrase that people are still allowed to use. As ever, until next time, do take care. Bye bye.
Bye bye.